Welcome again. My name is Luca Maestrini, and I'm the current president of the SSA ACT branch. And I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Tom Lawrence. And before providing a formal introduction, I would like to provide some reminders. A bit of housekeeping first. For those joining online, please ensure you mute your audio to minimize feedback. And we will try to leave questions for the very end of the talk. And if anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand online on Zoom or here in person. And then notice this meeting will be recorded and provided. The recording will be provided online soon after this meeting, perhaps tonight or tomorrow morning. Next, I would like to provide some details on the SSA, the Statistical Society of Australia. This is the national body that represents statisticians from across the country. And if you would like to find out more about all the events around the workshops, meetings, and other activities taking place at the national level and branch level, then you can visit the SSA website, www.statsocs.org.au. So now, welcome Tom. Tom Lawrence has worked as a data analyst in the Australian Public Service since early 2018. His current work focuses on using integrated data to answer key research questions regarding the early childhood and school teacher workforce. Previously, he completed a Master of Philosophy in Statistics at the University of Western Australia, and he has served on the SSA, WA, and ACT branch committees. Tom will be presenting a talk titled The Data Analyst Guide to PLIDA. Thank you.
So, Tom, just because the online people say was a bit muffled for Luca, I think you may need a little bit closer to the mic.
Yep, that's fine. I'll stand. I'll try standing here. That way I can turn between the overhead projector and the computer monitor where the camera is. Thanks for that, Luca. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting today, both here in the ACT and everywhere that people are joining us from online. I see there's quite a few people online, which is fantastic. And I'd like to pay my respects to all their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us at today's seminar. So, as Lucas said, I work for the Australian Public Service, specifically the Department of Education, but I'm presenting this talk to private citizens. But even so, I'm intending this talk be entirely apolitical and not controversial in any way. It's about a data set. It's not about any political issues. I'm not going to be going near the federal election or anything else contentious like that. If you've got questions that might be in that sort of area, please don't ask them during the seminar, but feel free to contact me afterwards to talk about those things private. So what is PLIDA? Well, it stands for Person Level Integrated Data Asset. And so what that means is that by integrated, it's a linkage. It's a linkage of numerous administrative data sets from mainly the federal government, but there's also some state and territory government data available in there. You may recognise it more from its original name, MADIP, the Multi-Agency Data Integration Partnership. That partnership started in 2015, and 3 years later in 2018, the first data became available for research purposes. The name PLIDA was introduced in 2023, and with it, an evolution in the data asset, which I'll be able to describe to you toward the end of the talk. So this talk is not going to be technical, but there are a few things we need to define first. The first of those being administrative data. What do we mean by that? It's data collected from every contact we will have from government and government services. So every 5 years we complete the census for population and housing. Every year, if we've earned enough money, we'll be submitting a tax return. We often use our Medicare cards. We've got one, and a lot of us will make use of welfare receipt, Centrelink, and other supports that the government provides. Imagine when you get it, but when this data is first collected, it's got a lot of sensitive personal information. But if it gets used for research purposes, analysis, that is, it has to go through a process of de-identification first to remove that information, so that it should be impossible to identify any individual from their records. And as a rule, if you try, you not only risk your own access to the data and your employer's access to the data, but there are criminal penalties in a lot of cases, including jail time and substantial fines. And besides which, most of that sensitive personal information has no relevance to an analyst. The administrative data is an incredibly rich information source. We can use it for a range of research questions, climate health questions, but it's quite limited. For example, higher education data. Some of you may have heard of the Competing Higher Education Project, the results of which are now on the Department of Education website. That's the federal department website. That project looked at whether what factors affected completion rates of university degrees. But as you can imagine, if you only look at higher education data, it's not going to look at a whole range of relevant factors. It will cover things like mode of attendance, so internal, external, type of attendance, so full-time and part-time, and so on. But it can't cover other factors that you might think are relevant, such as what employment students have, what income they might be receiving overall, and student support payments, their health situation, for example. That's where linkage, aka data integration, comes in. So you can link data sets together to bring together some or all the variables that are available through both. And administrative data is an example of where linkage can be used. And it involves matching from the two data sets to try and find cases where you've got a person or a business who's got a record in one data set, and you try and find that same person or business in the other data set. So how does this work? Well, I'll work through an example here. This is entirely synthetic data. Now, we don't even call this administrative data per se. I mean, this is a hypothetical situation of a car dealership that offers both car servicing and car sales. So in this example, as with administrative data, there's two parts of the data. There's the variables highlighted in red, which are the linkage information. That's that sensitive personal information which can identify individuals which we can't have access to for analysis, and by and large we wouldn't need. Then the other variables highlighted in green are analytical information. That's the information that's relevant for research and that we would want to be able to use. We need to be able to separate these out so that we can only look at as a first stage, so we can see the analytical information. And you'll notice here the right-hand red column and the right-hand green column have three dots there, just to acknowledge that there's likely to be other variables in such a data set. Once the data is collected, it would look like this, and it would go through a process of cleaning, which is intended to remove all errors. If your data set should only have one record per person or an upper limit of records per person, the cleaning process also tries to identify whether people have been accidentally identified twice or more often than that. Having cleaned the data, we then separate it out, but in doing that, we assign a random identifier to each record. And it's sort of an entirely randomly generated identifier, so that there's no way you could look at the identifier and pick out any of the sensitive information in the red table or in the analytical information in the green table. It's an entirely separate piece of information. And then, having done that, we can get linkage information for two data sets and attempt to link them. So in my example now, we've started with car service data, and now we've also got car sales data on the right-hand side. Oops, sorry, I went one slide too far. So that linkage is something I'm not hugely familiar with. All my work in so far has been on the analysis side. Linkage is usually done by people who are not in a role where they do any sort of analysis at all. I mean, typically, once the data sets are separated, nobody can have access to both the linkage information here in the red or the analytical information, which I previously showed you in the green. And you would have to be in a completely different role if you want to go from accessing one of those two data sites to the other. Linkage would be done by, as I said, an integrating authority, which is somebody who's approved to access these data sets, these sensitive sites, and work with them. And the method they might use, we divide into two main categories: deterministic, which means you look for exact matches on a set of variables, but that will fall apart in some cases because you'll have missing data, and you don't. And so there are probabilistic methods which you can use in those cases, which try and determine the probabilities that records match. But regardless of the type of method, they're usually quite robust, so that when you do the matching, and the bold black arrows here in the middle show where the matching has been done, typical kind of reasons why records might not exactly match can be overcome. So, for example, in this second row here, we've got a Joe Adams, but on the other side, we've got a Joseph Adams, and it's the same vehicle, it's the same chassis number. And the match will overcome the fact that the first names are different here. We recognise that a person called Joseph might be called Joe for short. And likewise here, with the third record down on the left-hand side, Diane Allen, if you look at the matching of it on the right-hand side, again, everything matches except the surname, and that's because there's been a typo, a deliberate typo here, but could be an accidental one. And again, matching methods should be robust enough to pick up on that and not be stalled by it. And the third record, the third match here, the second last row, is a case which would be achieved probabilistically if, it could be achieved deterministically if you ignore the chassis number and left that out of your matching criteria, but probabilistic matching will likely identify that one for you. So we've done the matching. And as you can see in the data set sales data, we have a separate ID to the service ID that we had for our first data set. So we have two random identifiers, and we add a third, and this identifier is common. So wherever we had a match, so we go Joe Adams here, the ID now that's in purple matches them across the two matching records. But we don't only assign these linkage IDs to the matching records. We assign them to all records in both data sets as a matter of principle, because in different situations, you'll have different needs. There may be some cases where you only need and are interested in the cases where you do get matches, but there are cases where you might want to use one data set as a base population, or where you want to use the combination of both data sets as a base population, and in either way, except you will have an amount of missing data. So the accredited integration authority has got to this stage, they will take the two left-hand columns and return that to, so the purple column, the linkage ID and the corresponding ID for the data set, and return that to the data owner or data custodian. So the data owner is the people who have the legal ownership of the data. The data custodian may be one and the same, they might be different. The role of the custodian is to work out who can have access to the data and provide the data. And each data custodian will then use the information provided from the linkage authority to attach those linkage IDs to both data sets, both analytical data sets, well, specifically to their own analytical information data set, and they will provide it to whoever requested that linkage be done. And so we could ask this linkage to be done, and we would get both data sets. Then in the final stage, we do the matching again, and in this case, we'll decide to keep all the records from both data sets. We get our final data set. We may or may not choose to keep the original ID codes in blue. The data custodians may choose to supply them. When they supply us with the data, they may choose not to. But having done this, we now have a much broader range of information. We've got information on the car's servicing in the month of September, and where available, the corresponding sales data if the car was known to be sold by the same company. So, we now looked at what administrative data is and how linkage works. Now we can start getting into how we access PLIDA. And that's through the ABS Data Lab. The ABS plays several roles in PLIDA. One is providing access to it. Another is as the accredited linking or integration authority. But the Data Lab is used for other purposes as well. It's used as a way for researchers to get access to a whole wide array of data sets, administrative data sets, for example. Not necessarily data sets that are owned by the ABS or they have custodianship over, but they have certainly a level of rights to them. That's my understanding. The way you would access those data sets is through a virtual machine, and that means you would log into a secure ABS website and open up a desktop within that website, within your main computer desktop. And these virtual desktops are very useful. They've already got some data packages available for you to use in there, like R and Python, and you can request more. But before you get it to that stage, you need to develop a project and request submit that for approval to the ABS. And that project needs to spell out what data sets you want access to. It might be PLIDA, it might be other ad sets. And you've got to give a case as to why the project's relevant, why you need the specific data sets, and so on. And you also need to consider information on all the people you can be involved in the project. And you have two general categories. You've got your analysts. Those are people who will get a login to ABS Data Lab and do the number crunching. The other type is discussants. These are people who won't get a login, but they will be able to sit down with you and talk about the data that you're working on. They'll be able to look over your shoulder at your computer screen to see what's on there in Data Lab. But they can't do any analysis of their own. As you might imagine, setting up a project, there'll be costs involved in that. There'll be costs per researcher and analyst, analyst to discuss it you want to have in your project. I believe the cost to analysts is still greater. And if you want a larger than standard size machine for extra processing power, again, there's another cost you'll need to factor into your project plan. And researchers, the approval process for them is twofold. There's proving that they need it for the project, but you also have to prove to the ABS, or they do, have to prove to the ABS that they are suitable people to be given access. And that means going through their own paperwork, through forms, undergoing training, and so on. There's one, but already I've covered a lot of rules here that Data Lab imposes. And why is that necessary? Because the data in Data Lab is, to start with, sensitive. Even though it might not have that, even though it will not have the personal information, it's still got private information about people, things like their income, their employment status. There is Medicare data available through there, and so it's not just so it's quite sensitive to start with. And even once you've got products created in there, you think, oh well, I might have, there's no privacy considerations, there's no risk to identify people in this data, it's reliable data. The ABS has not vetted it yet. That is, they've not done their own examination of what you've created and said, yes, we agree this is safe and we can share it. So, if you want to be able to share Data Lab with people, data with people who don't have access to your project, you have to request the ABS release that data. And unless until that time, nobody outside of your project can see the data, even if they've got Data Lab access. Even if they've got Data Lab access to a project which has the same or similar data sets. And you can't write down any of the data use. And you've got to check your computer screen and be careful about where you speak about the data. So people who don't have access to your project can't even accidentally see or hear anything they should. And as with a lot of necessary things, sets of work. You don't just do the training once if you want to get access to data. Like you have to redo it every 2 years at the moment. I understand there's a case to show that you still remember everything that you need to. But just as I mentioned, you can ask the ABS to consider releasing data from data lab. You can ask the ABS to add content to data lab for you. For example, suppose you might want to use data, you might want to use and so on, but remember, data you ask to be put into data lab won't be linked to anything unless you talk to the ABS and talk to relevant data owners about linking that data, getting the relevant permissions to that, and so on. Now we move into PLIDA itself, finally. So this diagram is one that was published in the chief statistician, David Gruen's presentation to a conference last year. I think it's quite a good version of the diagram. There's many versions of this diagram in various reports and articles and the like. As you can see, you can break down the wide array of data available in data lab into general categories. You might recognise a few things. You've got census of population and housing there right up the very top. And working clockwise, you've got things like visa information. In fact, you've got data on all entries to and departures from Australia, NDIS data in the yellow here, a range of health data, Medicare data, for example, in the orange, at the bottom right. Bottom left, you've got education data, tax data such as tax returns in the purple, and then in the blue in the top left, we have Centrelink and welfare data. The way PLIDA has been designed, a set of core data sets have been linked together to create a spine. And that spine being one record per person that has been identified from these records, from these key data sets. And then that spine gets linked to every other data set in PLIDA. As I said before, you can ask for other data sets to get into PLIDA. If you go to the PLIDA website, you can see the list of current and previous research projects using PLIDA, including data sets other people have linked. But do remember, just because another group has linked their data or linked data to PLIDA does not mean you can. You've still got to get your own approvals done separately, and it might even be a completely separate linkage process. But one thing I can say is that for those who are familiar with PLIDA, the business longitudinal analysis type environment, it has been linked to PLIDA. You can ask for that to be linked in. For example, if you want more detail on people's employers, then you might necessarily be able to find from other sources such as the tax returns. So for most of the rest of this talk, I'm going to look at some of what I consider to be the key data types and data sets in data lab, starting with the census for population and housing. Currently, the most recent censuses are available in data lab, in PLIDA, as is the Australian Census Longitudinal Data Set, the ACLD. Now, that data set is a case where a sample of census data across the censuses has been linked for research, and that's unusual because generally speaking, you can't see more than one census data at once, because when you're being asked, or perhaps so you might consider it, told to fill in the census instrument, we've not been asked to give permission for linkage or therefore given it. So for that reason, for the most part, if you want to access more than one census in a project in PLIDA or in data more broadly, the ABS will set up, and should the ABS approve that access, you'll get a separate virtual machine for each census. And you won't be able to transfer information between them unless you seek the ABS's permission. That can be handy, if you do have to use more than one census. Chances are some of your code, some of your notes will be applicable to more than one of them, rather one of your census assets. And rather than having to rewrite from scratch, the ABS can transfer to you, across for you, if you put in a request and they approve it. However, I recommend that you try to keep yourself to one census so that you don't have to go through that process. Because chances are you would have to go through it several times during the life of a project. And that requires some careful thought, because if you say you use more than one census, the earliest census might not, information you get in there could be out of date for any time that you look at from other data sets. That's from a later time period, and vice versa if you decide to use one of the later data sets. And of course, if you use these longitudinal data set, you're only looking at a sample. And therefore, whereas most other data sets in PLIDA are population level data sets, so you wouldn't make full use of them necessarily. The next part of the area I'll discuss is one that's close to my heart, coming from the Department of Education, the education data. So there's two data sets I'll give you a bit of context on. The first is the Australian Early Development Census. So this is run to look at school readiness. So it's looks at children who are in their first year of full-time school. It's filled in by their school teachers. And it's basically a series of questions, yes or no, the students have certain competencies, and some questions whether what level of competency they have. Everything from social skills to ability to walk, those kinds of questions. It's been run once every 3 years since 2009, and much of the data is now available in the Data Lab. And that can be handy for a lot of work. For example, if you are studying with children in your research, or you want characteristics of children of the people that you're looking at in your research, it can be a useful source. Although at the moment, it's very hard to match children to their parents in Data Lab or in PLIDA, or indeed any person to their parents. The other area of data I'd like to bring up here is higher education data. In a university here. And there's an array of data, set of data sets, so enrollments in courses and in units, there's completions, details of courses of the data set, and student loans and support are available. And there is international student data in there. If you've had past experience of PLIDA and MADIT, you may be aware that until early in 2024, we only had domestic student data in there. And so the international student data was a relatively new thing, this asset. However, international students will not necessarily link to other PLIDA data sets. For example, they're not necessarily going to tax return. They will not have access to Medicare or to assessment for other government entities. But with PLIDA assets like the higher education data, you've got a whole set of different data sets. You need to be careful. It's not just a matter of saying, oh, well, there's the PLIDA linkage spine that's already together. Because you might already have picked up on, between 2005 and 2021, a lot of people have enrolled in more than one course. And so there's a risk that you'll link information from one of their courses to information from another of their courses. So that just requires a bit of thought. I've already hinted talked a little bit about income data, so I'll cover that next. The data set I consider to be the main source of information here is the personal income tax data, or PIT data. But there are other data sets available, and that's important because not everybody submits a tax return every financial year. For example, you may not earn enough to be required to submit a tax return, and therefore you don't. So if you want to get a fuller range of income information, you need to look at some of the other data sets available. Income such as the payment summary data. But in these two examples here, we've got one data set each financial year for all the tax returns each financial year that we need to submit to the ATO, and the ATO payment summaries for employers that were submitted to the ATO. And this might guess without me saying so, each of those data sets is huge. And if you're trying to link them all together, it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of processing power. So it pays to be smart here, and in other cases, within PLIDA, to think carefully about how you want to work with those data sets to be as efficient as you possibly can. So that you're not spending hours and hours waiting for code to finish just to say, put all your data sets together. Following on from income, we have income support and other benefits. And this is quite a lot of different support payments and other benefits that are available to people, and they're being made available over 25 years at this data. And so if you try to analyze them individually, there's tens and tens and tens of potential variables you might be looking at. So it can pay to think about whether you put them into categories and whether you need necessarily all, each category. And I'm giving you some examples of potential categories you can consider use. But as well as thinking about categories, think about the criteria for it. As I said, there's a wide range of welfare payments and other benefits being made available. A lot of them have been introduced to year 2000. A lot of them have been discontinued prior to 2024. A lot of them have changed a lot in that time. So you should, my advice, you should take the time to do some research, go to public government websites to try and understand how these benefits have changed. So as you may find odd patterns in your data, which are just down to a new payment becoming available and a payment being discontinued, criteria changing, and you can distinguish that from genuine interesting behaviour. You also need to consider that these criteria can be other information that we're interested in. Can be the age of people, can be their income, can be their employment or their what education they're doing at the moment. And that introduces potential dependencies and relationships. So think carefully about how that might affect your work. You might need to exclude some variables from your data so that you can include income payments that you want, or vice versa. You might need to think about what methods you use that would allow for that kind of relationship to exist. And then also consider, I've certainly done each of those kind of things in my work, but it will obviously depend on the context of the work, what approach is right for you and for your work. The last category I'll cover here in this talk is health data. Again, there's a wide array of health data available. Immunisations data, MBS and PBS usage, as I've said here. But keep in mind that not all eligible treatments and eligible medications will get captured. So an absence of a treatment or a treatment type doesn't mean an absence of a health condition. For example, mental health. A lot of employers these days offer employee assistance programs, which provide a lot of, which can offer one-on-one therapy with a counsellor or group therapies or other therapies that you might get through the MBS if you get a referral from your doctor to a psychologist. You don't necessarily need a referral from your doctor necessarily to see a psychologist. In those cases, all those kind of treatments, they won't appear in the MBS, but they are still a mental health treatment that will be overlooked. And there are other data sets you'll come across in PLIDA where absence of information doesn't mean absence of the behaviour that you're interested in or characteristic that you're interested in. And there's a couple of other bits of advice I can give you here. The first is, some of these data sets, a lot of these data sets, you don't get nice little text variables, you'll get codes. And PLIDA already comes with metadata files so that you can find out more about that side of it and understand what a lot of these variables mean. There's also a publicly available Excel file with information on variables in PLIDA. But you can also go online and look for published information. For things like NBS and PBS codes, they need to be available to medical professionals, pharmacists, and the like, as they report them. And for higher education, there's the TSCI or TAXI website that lists a lot of higher education variables, because the higher education data is collected by universities and has to be provided to the Department of Education as part of the university's regular reporting. And the last bit of advice I've got here, which it's not so obvious when you look at the two data sets, well, the data sets I've given on this slide, but if you think about all the other data sets I've discussed, PLIDA data sets don't all cover the same time periods. They cover different ones. So you need to think carefully about how that's going to affect your work. It can potentially cut back heavily the scope of your work, the time period you want to look at, particularly if it's essential that you have data, you're not missing data from absence of available data. So, now we move to one other big problem you might have thought about, and that is a lot of these data sets are going to have variables in common, because they're relevant to those contexts, gender, indigenous status, age, characteristics of your home address. And if you link these together, you might think, oh, well, they should always be the same if they measure for the same time period, but that's not necessarily the case. And why does this happen? Well, different data sets are clean to different extents. So in one data set, we might have been able to go through to much greater detail and be confident we only got one record per person. And in another data set, it might be so much together that we can't practically do that. So there might be cases of two people who live close to each other with similar names who actually get considered as one of the same person. For example, children in the same household, say twins who've got this very similar name, it's Charlie and Charlie. But there's also an issue that a lot of this data will be collected by asking people to provide, through the census when they enroll in universities and so on. In different contexts, you might have a different view on whether you really want to provide information. You might wonder whether it's prejudiced, you might wonder whether it's really relevant. So then, you might give a different answer to the question. You might deliberately lie. I think, well, maybe telling a lie is not the end of the world, and get away with it. You get differences. How do we deal with this? Well, the ABS is part of designing matter, creating a sole source of truth. So they can create three combined data sets, which they did by linking key data sets together and that are able to apply it and identifying common and working out from that what the correct values of each variable be. And there's an indigenous demographics data set, another demographics data set, and a locations data set available. And as part of the evolution that's come from changing the name of the data asset from matter to PLIDA, they're transitioning to core data sets, which means that those sole sources of truths, I believe, will be generated a little bit differently, and there'll be some other ones coming out. For example, already in the file I mentioned that's publicly available in PLIDA variables, you'll see that there's a relationships for data set being created, so that you will be able, with some confidence, identify parents of people in your examining or their children, whether they've got children, the characteristics of those children, and so on. And I would recommend you use data sets always. And as a result of that, as a result of linkage issues and so on, you may find that when you're getting results, they don't match up to public data. And I would always try to get hold of publicly accessible data, go to government websites, and use that as a bit of a sense check as you're going along. You certainly can't manually transcribe data between your virtual machine and anywhere else. You're looking at public available data, but you should expect that there will be some differences, potentially not huge, they might be big, and therefore you should make an effort not just to do that sense checking, but to liaise with the ABS and the owners and custodians of the data, which are generally fairly obvious. Income tax data is obviously owned and by the ATO, the custodian, or two, so that you can understand a bit more about maybe there may be other reasons why your results don't match up with theirs, but it's also, I know this from experience in the public service, if that doesn't happen, sometimes, and you publish your data, that number can work its way to us, and we get asked, where did this number come from? We have no idea where it comes from, so we can't get any background to it. Explain why it might be so different to what we've got from our other work in other areas with other data sets. So this brings me to the end of the talk. I did mention repeatedly that you should look online for information right the way through any work you do in data, PLIDA particularly. So the first 4 articles here are all relevant ones. They've got the article chief data box that I provide the graph from. The productivity distribution report here at the bottom of the list. That's quite comprehensive. That's there. The views on PLIDA information. We've got the migration work that Bernard et al. Did. Looking into migration data in PLIDA, plus that completing our education project I mentioned before. And I've also included what I think are the 2 most important data sets for PLIDA in the AGS as well. Now, I'll conclude by saying, if you do any work here or think about doing any work with PLIDA, by all means, come and talk to people like me and others who have access to PLIDA. But remember, we're not on your project, and I doubt we give given permission to get access to it. So you can't talk to us about data, the actual numbers. And we certainly can't talk to you about, data or numbers from our PLIDA work, but we can certainly talk to you about variables, data, assets, and so on. And I encourage you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for a very informative talk. Any questions from the audience here? Yes.
You mentioned that there are costs associated with getting access to data. Do institutions have arrangements, like just the University of Australia have an arrangement with the AGS to cover costs? Are you aware of that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question so that people can?
Okay. So the question was, do institutions have existing arrangements with the ABS where the costs had already been covered, rather than having to pay them for the individual project? That's a good question. I don't know that off the top of my head. There might be some information on that on the ABS website. You can certainly go on there and get the details for the PLIDA Data Lab teams and talk to them directly about that. Maybe I think, if you think you might know within your institution who would be working most closely with the ABS, you could talk to them directly as well to see whether they've got any arrangements in place.
Have you done any work standardizing data sets from different in terms of jurisdictions, where the systems don't necessarily measure the same thing, or the legislation is different, so the data capture is slightly different?
Repeating the question. Yeah, so is there any work being done to standardize data sets that have been created by jurisdictions? I don't know the answer to that, but all areas. I would say that where that's an issue, the ABS would be, again, the first point of contact as regards to PLIDA data sets. For other data sets, I would, I know there's ones that are not available in PLIDA at the moment, that could be constructed that way. I would go to the people who own those data sets and ask them to see if we can get about that. Do any questions online?
Any question online?
Yes, I've been looking at shared code library and having to do some work in an standardized data. Example standards for processing activity and social activity and that's reusable by all. Especially useful for you to apply that. Is there something you could touch on?
Yes. Interesting one. I have to admit, I've not heard a lot about that. I like this very well. So, my answer to there's the code library to be developed. Excellent. Standardized data sets and change projects. Not really familiar with that. I mean, I know a bit more about PLIDA and what's been done in there than data lab more generally. But it does sound like something that would be a huge benefit in this area. You know, so, for example, I've mentioned before with the census issue. You look at one census at a time. Are data sets on the data lab available in a useful format like Parquet, or do you need to load from CSV? I believe for the most part they're available in CSV, and if you ask the ABS for access to SAS, they can also provide you with a SAS version. Otherwise, I believe you would have to make your own Parquets, and you can do that in PLIDA. There is a possibility to do that through R, for example. I'll move to these.
Those scenarios where there is this linkage or no linkage, how does the bias basis handle this? How can the bias basis handle the scenarios where this observation has chances of mislinkage or invalidation?
That's a question. Do the biases associated with missing linkages and non-linkages? Well, that's something that yes, in looking at the data sets has worked on. When I talked before about spines, each data set there's a file with the spine IDs and a corresponding ID for the data set. And those corresponding IDs, basically ABS's read through of the link, the enemy assigned code. Thanks, Luke. Yeah, I mean that's true. And so David's pointed out, Dr. Luke's pointed out, I know it well, he's worked in public education. We've got the linkage reports in there as well, but the spine files do have some information on the quality as well that you can use in that. So in response to Kate's question about the data dictionaries, as I mentioned before, if you Google TCSI, you can get the website for the higher education data. I gave you the link to the page where you can download the variable file, the file that shows all the different data assets, all the different variables in PLIDA. And so you can do a bit of detective work as well. I mean, you can search for some of the variables, as I said before. Some of them will be available through government department websites because they need to be available to people who need to report with them. And because of that, they end up on other websites as well. But just be careful if you go to non-government websites because they won't be checked by the government necessarily, and therefore can have errors because people try to put things in their own words.
We have a question from Elle here.
There's a question about timeline with regard to like if you've got a project that you have in mind and so you need to do data lab training apply for your project, like what kind of timeline are you looking at, particularly if you have term staff? Is it feasible in a PhD project or is that a high risk? Right, those kinds of things. Please start waiting.
Oh yeah. There are quite a lot of delay. So the question is about what timelines do you need to consider for your the data lab and PLIDA project, and timeframes do you need to allow for? The answer is a lot. There are quite significant delays because the ABS needs to be thorough in vetting everything. And in PLIDA, every data custodian, the owner, has to have their own say on projects involving their data, on outputs involving their data. Part of that is just them doing their own checking and satisfying themselves that all's well and good. But things like releasing data, there may also be a need for those owners to prepare briefs for senior staff or ministers and so on, so that they know how to answer questions about that data if and when that data reach the media, for example, or reach the public, and then we've got the department from queries. So for a PhD project, I think it's definitely possible to use PLIDA, because when we're not talking about several years worth of delays like necessarily. Yeah. So that's right. Yeah. So it's look, the appeals process takes weeks. The training depends how often the ABS is running them at the time. What's available there. Yeah, I do know that once you do the training for the first time, you get access to a website where you can do it completely online for your refreshers. So there's plenty of opportunity to do that training. It's not particularly hard training. It's more about your obligations and processes than any skill, certainly. Although there is the important aspect to it of what you do to make sure your data that you want to get outputted meets all the various ABS rules. But it does require a bit of lateral thinking sometimes. If you're impressed what people will do to be able to get information from your data that they shouldn't be able to get.
Actually, it's more like what calculation is the data from the data sets that it shows. Just seems like PLIDA does not any data on temporary residents. So that's where I'm kind of.
Right. So actually, it will. Sorry,
mind repeating the question?
Yeah. Thanks for reminding me, Lucas. So the question there was about what population is captured through PLIDA, and would it include, would it include temporary residents? The answer is it will cover everybody who is in Australia during that time. So, because the migrant data will capture all entries into and departures from Australia, should do. But the richest data will be on the people who have citizens and ship or permanent residency, and therefore will be making a lot more use of government services.
So the gaps, yeah, in there, but there will be gaps instead of.
That's right. There will be some gaps. I mean, it does depend on how. If you want to focus solely on migrants, then yeah, there are going to be a lot more gaps. That's true. But it doesn't mean it's impossible.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So when integrating international data sources, like in the case of the education and data, do international agencies or national agencies from different countries talk to each other in some cases or not? Like, for example, in the example you provided, do they just go online and look for sources available online, or do national agencies talk to each other?
Right. So that's a good question. I don't know what other agencies do in terms of that discussion. When I mentioned international students in higher education data, that's students who are enrolled as international students, meaning they're not domestic at any time during their studies, and therefore they can't be an Australian or New Zealand citizen or permanent resident. They'll have a particular refugee status. And therefore, they'll be on a particular visa, most likely. Studies, therefore, have qualifications on that.
I think it's a good time to wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for attending this talk, and thank you, Tom, again.